Hi, I'm Wei-Chieh and this is my Pi project presentation. So my Pi project is going to be building a VPN server on Raspberry Pi with a network-wide app blocker. With the Raspberry Pi VPN, you can encrypt all data traffic in the network. So this is really useful while using either public Wi-Fi or home Wi-Fi, as personal data might leak through virus and through ads. Um, since I am not located in US, so I'm currently in Taiwan doing online classes. Um, VPN is really useful for me because I need um, I need to get access to some data for my schoolwork. So, for example, I took CNIT 272 last semester, and it was basically um, we basically worked on SQL databases, and I had to connect to the Purdue VPN to get the database so I can do my work. After all, VPN is a really useful tool for private and corporate environments. The network-wide app blocker allows me to surf the internet without getting annoyed by advertisements showing up. Moreover, advertisement not only annoys people, but it is also a security. Um, it, it is also a security problem. So I believe the project would be pretty straightforward, as we cover most theories in lectures and also through past labs that involve a Raspberry Pi. So how I did my project. Um, so first of all, um, in the lecture we learned about routers and gateways. So a router basically receives a packet and it passes it on to correct recipients. And a gateway, like a router, does the same thing, but it connects to dissimilar networks. Um, so I did some research, and from the guide I found, what I'm doing is creating a gateway into my Wi-Fi, home Wi-Fi, from the internet on my Raspberry Pi, which makes a tunnel in my network, so I can have my own traffic. So basically, for the ad blocker, what I had to do, what I so first of all, I did a lot of outside research, since this part wasn't really covered in the lectures, but this is related to the TCP and IP model, which we covered in lecture, which describes how data get transported across a network. So as we know, if you guys do remember, there are three top layers to the model. At the top application layer, you can find something called DNS, and then below that is transport layer connecting the UDP, and below that is network layer that contains IP. So DNS stands for Domain Name System, and it basically allows users to make a reference to an IP address without needing to memorize a whole bunch of IP numbers. This is important because human beings are more sensitive to a meaningful word than a string of numbers. Um, so we use DNS every time you use the internet. For example, YouTube.com, Facebook.com, Purdue.edu, cdc.gov, so and etc. So these are all DNS. We all use DNS while we serve these websites. And for IP, in lecture we learned about IP, which is a 32-bit number that can be converted into binary. So what DNS does is basically it translates this 32-bit number, which is hard for a human to memorize and read. So basically, DNS translates this machine readable to human readable. And whenever a website displays an ad to you, there needs to be a DNS request for the ad provider's IP address. And an ad, as I said before, an ad not only annoys you while you surf the internet, but it may also be a security risk. So then to what I did, so how I did my Pi project was basically reassigning all of the DNS traffics that occur on my VPN to a new DNS provider called Pi-hole. So this app I used, Pi-hole, its DNS has a built-in function that compares every DNS request we receive to a list of common known ad provider. If there's a match, then it denies the request. So which means the ads gets blocked. So after the Pi-hole, we worry about file systems. So once we get our VPN running set on our Pi and created a new user or two in VPN, all of the information gets stored in a configuration directory, which we want to be able to navigate. So step one for my project is to designate an open port on my router using a basic network utility tool. That port is where our gateway is going to end up being. After that, I used the curl command on my Pi to install an app called Pi VPN. Once that is installed, it basically acted as an installer for OpenVPN, which I used, which I installed on my Pi and also on my PC for later use. Since OpenVPN is a really popular app, and it is popular enough that the installer asks you when you install, and the installer asks you to declare your IP address, what kind of encryption you want, and what port you're using, and who your selected DNS provider is. So for my IP address, I made it the same for my Pi IP address, and for the encryption, I chose a 256-bit encryption, and also I selected the Pi-hole for my DNS providers. And then step two is I created a user, so for my VPN, and as I mentioned before, I installed OpenVPN for my Pi, but then now I have to do the same thing on my PC, so I installed OpenVPN on my PC. Then to the Pi-hole, so I worked on a Pi-hole, and then I used IP address on my Pi for that, and I chose to plug in an Ethernet cable, and then I was able to see the list of providers that were blocked. When Pi-hole was done, I had to do was look at my IP address. So I Googled it, and eventually it showed up something with the Pi-hole sign on it, and it was a admin page which allows me to log in, and I could eventually see my VPN, the page for my VPN and all the datas. But when this is when I thought I was done, but I did not. But I wasn't done yet, because I started troubleshooting then. The page told me that my DNS was down, which means that all my DNS requests were not being processed because since the system is down and all the DNS requests cannot be done, which means that my Pi cannot access to the internet. Um, this is so I started to think back what I did wrong. So basically, when I installed OpenVPN, it actually showed up two choices. One is OpenVPN and one is WireGuard. So I looked up what WireGuard is, and it is basically something like VPN but more modern and more safe to use. So it's like a upper level. So it's like a higher level of OpenVPN. So I chose that, which did not work, and so I went back to install OpenVPN again and chose the OpenVPN instead of WireGuard. And eventually, um, when I rebooted it, it did not. It just worked, and so that was a really good lesson to follow the guide I found, and also really good for reflecting because I went back to think what I did wrong, and then eventually I successfully done my Pi project, and yeah, so that would be all for my Pi project. Thank you.